One pig, one potato field, and a line on a map almost pushed Britain and the United States into war. Not a small local fight, not a shouting match between settlers, a real crisis. Soldiers, warships, cannons aimed at camps. Two powers watching each other across a tiny island in the Pacific Northwest. And the strange part is that nobody could even agree where the border was supposed to be. To see how it came to this, we have to go back to the end of the American Revolution. When the United States gained independence from Britain, representatives met in Paris to settle the terms. America gained far more than independence. Britain also recognized a huge stretch of territory west of the original colonies. For the young United States, the continent suddenly looked wide open. Not empty, of course. Many indigenous nations already lived there. But American leaders increasingly looked west and saw land to settle, control, and eventually absorb into the growing republic. Some Americans even looked north toward Canada and wondered whether the British colonies there might one day become American too. Britain had no interest in handing over Canada, so the two countries had to define a border. At first, that seemed simple. Some parts could follow rivers, some could follow lakes. In places, a straight line looked convenient. Then came a geographical problem. The treaty described a line running west from the northwestern point of the Lake of the Woods until it reached the Mississippi River. There was only one flaw. The map was wrong. The lake was not shaped as neatly as people had believed. The Mississippi River was not where the treaty makers thought it was. The intended straight line could not actually reach the river in the way they imagined. A border had been written into an agreement using inaccurate geography. For the moment, people accepted it. The problem could be handled later. Then the United States and Britain went to war again. The War of 1812 was not a decisive victory for either side. The Americans tried to invade Canada. British troops burned the White House. By the end, neither country had achieved everything it wanted, and both returned to the negotiating table. Once again, the border became an issue. The earlier arrangement had clearly failed. By this point, the United States had also acquired a vast amount of territory from France through the Louisiana Purchase. That made the western boundary even more important. The new agreement created another straight line. From the Lake of the Woods, the border would run down to the 49th parallel. Then it would continue west along that parallel until it reached the Rocky Mountains. That solved part of the problem, but only part. Beyond the Rockies lay a massive region that both sides claimed. To Americans, it was Oregon country. To the British, it was a valuable part of British North America. And neither side intended to simply walk away. The United States was developing a powerful belief about its future. Many Americans thought their country was meant to spread across North America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Expansion was presented as natural, righteous, even divinely approved. This idea would later be called manifest destiny. It was a convenient belief for a nation that wanted more land. If westward expansion was destiny, then taking territory could be described as fulfilling a mission. Settlers could be called pioneers. Conquest could be called progress. The people already living on the land were pushed aside in the name of a larger national future. Britain had its own reasons to care about the region. At the time, Canada was made up of several British colonies. Much of the land in the Northwest was tied to the Hudson's Bay Company, a powerful British company whose business depended heavily on the fur trade. Beaver pelts were valuable. They could be used to make fashionable felt hats. The company wanted access to rivers, trading routes, and the areas where fur-bearing animals could be found. Indigenous communities played a major role in that trade. Their knowledge, labor, and networks helped supply the company. For Britain, the Columbia River was especially important. It offered access into the interior and supported the fur trade that made the region profitable. The Americans wanted the entire continent. The British wanted the river system and its resources. Neither side accepted the other's claim. A possible compromise existed. The border could follow the Columbia River, giving both sides access. But compromise was not popular. Instead, Britain and the United States agreed to a temporary solution. They would jointly occupy the Oregon Territory. Both countries could settle there. Both could trade there. Both could claim that the final question had not yet been decided. It was not a true solution. It was a pause. and pauses become dangerous when one side starts arriving in much larger numbers. One British official who understood this was James Douglas. Douglas worked for the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver. He was practically severe and deeply suspicious of American expansion. He saw the Pacific Northwest as part of Britain's future. In his mind, it was land that needed to be protected from settlers arriving from the south. But settlers were arriving. Thousands of Americans began traveling west along the Oregon Trail. They came in wagons. They crossed rivers, mountains, and open plains. Some were looking for farmland, some wanted opportunity, some simply wanted a new start. Many also faced disease hardship and terrible conditions along the journey. Still, they kept coming. The growing number of American settlers changed the balance in Oregon. The Hudson's Bay Company had built its influence around fur trading posts and commercial networks. The Americans came to farm. They wanted permanent homes fields and local government. Farming settlements did not fit easily with a fur economy. More settlers meant less open land for trapping. More settlers meant more pressure on the British trading system. And more settlers meant that any future border decision might be shaped by who was already living on the ground. Eventually, Douglas and other Hudson's Bay Company men were ordered to move north, away from Fort Vancouver. For Douglas, it was a warning. Americans were no longer just passing through the disputed territory. They were changing it. By the 1840s, Americans in Oregon outnumbered British settlers by more than 6-1. The idea of joint occupation was beginning to look unrealistic. Then James K. Polk became President of the United States. Polk strongly supported American expansion. He claimed that the United States had a right to the entire Oregon region, all the way to the northern line, known as 54 degrees 40 minutes. American politicians used aggressive language. Some spoke as though a war with Britain would be acceptable. The United States officially gave notice that it intended to end the agreement for joint occupation. Britain was alarmed. For a moment, the two countries stood close to another war. But neither side truly wanted one. Britain valued trade with the United States. The Americans were already fighting Mexico, and opening another major conflict with the British Empire would have been risky. So both sides stepped back. In 1846, they reached the Oregon Treaty. The border would follow the 49th parallel westward to the Strait of Georgia. Britain would keep Vancouver Island. From there, the boundary would run south through the middle of the channel and reach the Pacific Ocean. On paper, the northwest border was finally settled. In reality, one sentence had created another problem. The treaty said the line would go through the middle of the channel. But there was more than one channel. That mattered because a group of islands lay between Vancouver Island and the mainland. If the intended route was the Rosario Strait, the islands belonged to Britain. If the intended route was the Haro Strait, they belonged to the United States. The islands included San Juan Island. The British insisted the Rosario Strait was meant. The Americans argued for the Haro Strait. Both interpretations sounded possible. Even some of the people involved in negotiating the treaty were not entirely sure which channel had been intended. Officials on the ground asked their governments to clarify the issue. The response was not urgent. For leaders in London and Washington, small islands in a distant corner of the continent did not seem like the most important matter in the world. There were elections, wars, trade problems, and domestic politics to handle. A vague line between two channels in the Pacific Northwest could wait. So San Juan Island remained disputed. James Douglas did not think it should wait. By then, he had become governor of Vancouver Island. He believed the islands were British, and he feared that American settlers would arrive first, establish farms, raise flags, and create a new reality before diplomats could decide anything. Douglas had a solution. If Britain put settlers on the islands, Britain would have a stronger claim. In 1853, he sent Charles Griffin, an Irishman working for the Hudson's Bay Company, to establish a sheep farm on San Juan Island. Griffin did not go alone. Hawaiian shepherds were also sent to help run the operation. The farm became substantial. It had 1,369 sheep. It also had several valuable Berkshire pigs. The sheep farm was not just a business. It was a political statement. Britain was on the island. America noticed. In 1854, an American customs collector sailed through the area looking for indigenous raiders. While traveling around the islands, he spotted the British sheep operation. The American official believed the farm stood on American territory. The British believed it stood on British territory. The disagreement immediately became a question of taxes. The Americans said British property on the island should pay American customs duties. If payment was refused, the property could be seized. The British said the Americans had no authority there at all. Neither side backed down. Douglas tried to give Griffin more legal power by appointing him a magistrate. Griffin then made one of the Hawaiian shepherds a constable. British officials attempted to arrest the American customs officer. The attempt did not go smoothly. The American came out armed with pistols and a large knife. The British did not force the issue. Eventually, the customs officer left the island after raids by northern indigenous groups made his position difficult. But the tax dispute continued. Officials from Whatcom County and Washington Territory decided the British farm owed them money. They sent Sheriff Barnes to demand $80.33 in taxes. Griffin refused. The sheriff and county officials then claimed they had the right to seize livestock and sell it at auction to recover the unpaid money. The livestock they chose were Griffin's breeding rams. The officials tied the animals to boats and took them away. When Griffin tried to stop them, guns were drawn. He could do nothing. In total, he lost 34 breeding rams. Griffin was furious. The British government protested to the Americans. The American government was surprised that local officials had taken matters so far. Both governments told their people in the region to calm down. No one in London or Washington wanted a major war over sheep taxes and a disputed island. Still, both governments continued to claim the islands. Another boundary commission was created to settle the Channel question. It did not settle much. The discussions often descended into stubborn arguments, technical disputes, and mutual suspicion. At one point, the British offered an interesting compromise: divide the disputed islands between the two countries. The Americans refused. The dispute stayed alive. Then a new event made it worse. Gold was discovered in the Fraser Canyon north of the disputed islands. Douglas immediately worried that news of gold would pull in even more Americans. He had already watched American settlers transform Oregon. Now, a gold rush could bring thousands of people into British territory near Vancouver Island. That is exactly what happened. Americans rushed north. Some found gold. Most did not. Many of those who failed to strike it rich chose not to make the long journey home. They looked around for land where they could settle. San Juan Island looked attractive. Its green pasture land was appealing. Its location was convenient. And American settlers believed the island belonged to the United States. By the late 1850s, around a dozen American settlers had moved there. One of them was Lyman Cutlar. Cutlar was in his mid-20s. He wanted a place to live, but did not want to do more work than necessary. Instead of clearing land in the forest, he built his cabin in the middle of the British sheep run. Then he planted potatoes. There was another problem. Cutlar built only a weak fence around part of his garden. The rest was left exposed, even though British farm animals wandered nearby. For a while, this created constant trouble. Griffin's Berkshire pig had a habit of rooting around for food. Cutlar's potatoes were exactly the kind of food a hungry pig would notice. The pig entered Cutlar's garden more than once. Cutlar chased it away again and again. At one point, he went to Griffin and demanded that the animal be kept off his property. Griffin saw things differently. Cutlar, in Griffin's view, was an American settler building on British land. Why should the British farmer have to change his operation for someone who should not be there in the first place? The argument grew bitter. Cutlar believed American authorities had recognized his land claim. Griffin believed Cutlar was trespassing in a British sheep run. The pig kept returning to the potatoes, and neither man was willing to give way.